Hey, welcome back to the Personality Hacker Podcast. My name is Joel Mark Witt.
And I'm Antonia Dodge.
Today we are bringing a guest back. Nii Codjoe is with us again. Hi, Nii.
Hi.
And if you remember from the previous podcast, Nii is a team member here at Personality Hacker. And it's actually been really nice because Personality Hacker is filled with a bunch of crusty Generation Xers or a bunch of crusty Xers. And Nii has come on with a fresh millennial perspective.
And as a young millennial man, he works with us here at Personality Hacker. We thought we could do some conversations around your career as a person. Now, you may not be a millennial listening. You might be a little older than that. You might be in a transition time of your career or coming down to this idea that maybe I'm just on the wrong track in life. Maybe I want to try something different. Or maybe you're listening right now and you're ready to graduate, or you've recently graduated. You're trying to figure out what you're going to do in the world for your work. And I think this is something that can cause a lot of people stress or de-stress, like it distresses them basically, because there's so much pressure in our world to go to college, to get a good job, to do the right thing. And then add on top of that, this idea of like, not only do I want to work in something, I want to make a big impact in the world and using my life for good. And there's this notion of I want to do so much, but I have no idea how to get from where I'm at right now into the impactful work that I want to do. And sometimes it can feel overwhelming. And then you look on, Instagram and Twitter and social media, and maybe friends of yours or other people, your peer group, are having success, and you're like, how are they doing it? And then you might have envy. Like, there's all these narratives that come out around work and the impact we want to make as people, especially if you're listening to this podcast and others like it, around personal growth and making a big difference in the world.
So we've been having a lot of conversation around these topics, and Nii, you came up with it's kind of an interesting way of titling it, but you were talking about this concept of living a life of leftovers. Can you explain to the person listening what exactly that means?
Yeah, so my wife and I have been having this conversation around the idea of work in the Western world. Just to give a little context, my wife is an INTJ and I'm an ENTJ. So we've been talking a lot about this idea of work-life balance and how it's a goal that most people are trying to achieve in their careers. And what's interesting about how we think about work in the Western world is that we actually separate work and life. We got work on one side and we have life on the other side, and we're trying to balance them. But I think there's this myth around the modern workday, right? Most people are working 9 to 5 roughly, and in their mind, they're going to spend their weekends and their evenings doing their own thing. But if you actually sit down and look at the numbers, most people aren't working 9 to 5. It's more like 7 to 7. So the average person gets about 8 hours of sleep. So that means we've got 16 hours awake. We're going to spend about 12 hours of our day working. If you think about the time that you get up in the morning, and you grab your toothbrush and you brush your teeth and you go downstairs and you grab breakfast or a quick cup of coffee and you get in your car and you're sitting through traffic. Maybe you're listening to this podcast on your way to work. And then you get to work and you sit through work, you pack up your bag, you get in your car, you sit through traffic again, you go home, you grab some food, you're still checking emails and trying to unwind from the day. So really, most of us aren't working 9 to 5. It's more like 7 a.m. to 7 p.m. And so that doesn't really leave us a lot of time afterwards. It leaves us with a few hours to do everything else. Grab groceries, eat, run errands. There's just not a lot of time left over. And that's where this idea of living a life of leftovers emerged from. And so I think what's interesting is, if we hate our jobs or we feel dissatisfied with the work we're doing, the question we have to ask ourselves is, does that mean we hate our lives? If we're spending most of our waking life working, but we are unfulfilled and unhappy with that work, what does that say about our life? And I think that's a really sobering thought.
So the idea of the leftovers is just whatever time you have. Like, that's like the leftover time you have. And I'm assuming that it's intended to evoke this metaphor of the leftovers in your refrigerator. It's like, it's not fresh, it's not high quality, it's not like, it's just whatever you can microwave and get away with. And so the hours in our day that are left over after we spend all this time at work or thinking about work or, commuting to work or whatever, then the little bit of time you have at the end of all of that before you have to sleep it's kind of on the same level of sort of exciting, which is like nuked food basically.
Exactly. And it just seems like an unsustainable model. And it seems like a recipe for, it can feel like a recipe for having an unhappy life if we're stuck in a situation where we don't enjoy our work. And so I think it's important that we redefine our relationship to work. So I feel like this conversation is part of a bigger motif around work in the Western world. And I think our society encourages us to live a low-risk life. This is something my wife and I love to talk about all the time and see it, try to observe it in our lives or in the lives of other people. But this idea of low-risk living is this. It's the art of living a safe, conventional life that conforms to the expectations of our family, friends, and society. It's keeping up the status quo by censoring who we really are. And most people are following this path. They're following this script that society has handed them, that you need to get a job. And even if you don't like it, it's okay because you can live for the weekend. Even though when the weekends come, we're spending that time trying to rest and recoup from the work that we just spent, 60 hours of our week doing. And really, people that followed this path of low-risk living end up going through almost like this 3 stages in life, or this 3-act play. And we can think of Act 1 as the transition from being maybe like a college student, and now you're being thrown into the real world. Now you're an adult, and suddenly you're expected to have everything figured out. When you were younger, it was cute and adorable that you had dreams and aspirations and that you wanted to be a doctor or an astronaut or change the world. Then the moment you become an adult, it's almost as if the light switches or the flip switches, and now you're expected to have everything figured out, and all the dreams that you grew up with are now unrealistic and impractical, and what you need to do is get something that's a job or career that's more realistic and safe. It almost feels like it feels a little bit like puberty part 2. Right there, when you transition into the real world, there's just so many changes emotionally, mentally, and trying to recalibrate and define, who am I and what kind of work do I want to do in the world? What kind of contribution do I want to bring? And then in the second act, this is when people start going through the motions, right? They cling on to that safe, secure job, and they start going through the 9 to 5, and they're doing what my wife and I like to call white knuckle work. It's when you're just kind of pushing through the work. You don't really love it, but you know that it's the responsible, respectable thing to do as an adult, and you're just going through the motions, hoping one day you'll be able to find something more fulfilling. And then we hit the third act of this play, or the story arc, and that's when you get old, and it's a season when you retire and you look back on your life. And it's often full of regrets for people of like, man, I spent my entire life going through the motions, doing something that wasn't really fulfilling for me because I was living a low risk life. So that's I think a symptom of the way that the West thinks about work.
So as you're talking, Nii, I'm reminded of a movie that came out back in the 1990s called Mr. Holland's Opus. And it's about this music teacher at a high school who had dreams of being a symphony conductor, writing musical compositions, and like having this amazing artistic career. And he got married and had a baby, and he had to like pay the bills. It was like the 1960s the story takes place in, and he had to go and get a job teaching music at this high school. And interestingly, in the movie, the movie unfolds with him, showcasing basically how the arts aren't really honored in our school systems and how the budgets get cut and all this. And it's the arc of watching his life unfold, not having lived his dreams, which is a really interesting movie. I remember my dad taking me to it, and my dad like crying at it. It was just a really powerful, introverted feeling styled movie. And I won't spoil the end, but basically, it basically just kind of showcases this. And there's a line in the movie, I don't remember if it was quoted from somebody else or if it was actually from the movie, but he says, "Life is what happens to you when you're busy making other plans." And it's kind of like what you're painting, this picture of when you get to your older years and you look back on a life and you go, I didn't even see this happen. Like, how did I get here? I had dreams, I had goals, I had ambitions, I want to change the world. And somehow I ended up kind of doing what I wanted, but also I'm looking back at a life going, I didn't grab life by the throat. I didn't like make something happen, and I might be frustrated. I think for me, that's like one of my fears is like I'll look back and have all these regrets, like, oh no, I didn't do this thing. And I think that you're painting a picture for me, approaching middle age, that's a fear that I can feel burgeoning. Like I'm running out of time in life. And I can't imagine what it might feel like right now. I mean, I remember when I was, around 20 or something, the feeling of, man, there was a lot of pressure, I think, when I was younger. Now it feels like time's running out. Back then it was like, if I don't pick the right track, I'll be off track. And I remember that being the anxiety at the time. So I think it really depends on your stage of life. You probably have some kind of anxiety around this, whatever it is, whether it's you're running out of time. Maybe you feel like if you're like in your 70s or 80s, maybe you feel like you've already run out of time and you're just like, oh no, did I do everything I want to do? Or if you're young, you're like, what, if I don't pick the right course, I'm going to be way off the whole thing. And I think it speaks to something that a lot of us can resonate with as an anxiety we have. Did you struggle with that as a young person? Because you're like approaching 30 now. Like when you were in your early 20s and in college, were you like, oh God, if I don't pick the right track, I'm going to be way off? Or did you kind of just, like, is it something more new that you're realizing now in your life?
So when I was in my early 20s, there was a lot of anxiety because I knew I was going to be jumping into the real world. I saw this happen with my friends. As soon as you jump into the real world, all of a sudden you're just expected to know who you are, what you're going to do with your life, and you're just expected to have a crisp, clear plan. And it needs to be reasonable and it needs to be safe. And I just felt a lot of fear around that because I knew that I didn't want that type of life. So being an ENTJ, leading with extroverted thinking, I was like, I have to come up with a solution to solve this problem because I can't go down that path. I've seen too many people go down that path to where their life is just leftovers. Their life is just whatever they have after work. And I couldn't have that happen for me. So I started looking for people who loved what they were doing. Everyone from top executives to artists. And the question I was looking for is like, what's the common denominator here? People that are doing work they love and making an impact in the world, what do they have in common? And what do they understand that I don't? Or that most of people in society don't? So I started this project of just trying to find these people. And what emerged is this pattern that there are a group of people in the world that have a completely different relationship to work than most of us do, right? So for example, most people are working to just pay the bills. People who have a career calling, they're using their work as a tool to make an impact in the world, whether it's big or small. Another thing that I started to notice as I found people that were doing meaningful work in the world is that most people are working in their careers. They go to work and they're putting their head down and they're just pushing through, hoping to get to the weekends. But for people who have a career calling, they are not only working in their career, but they're also working on their career. They're stepping back and asking themselves the question, what am I good at? What gifts do I bring to the table? What are the opportunities in the world that I can attach myself to and do something meaningful? And they step back and ask those questions instead of just going into autopilot and following the script that society has handed to them. So these people have what I call a career calling, and I define a career calling as a situation where you're wielding your superpower to do worthwhile work in the world. You're serving people, you're solving problems, and you're making an impact. And a career calling isn't something that you hunt for and find. Instead, it's something that you cultivate like a garden. And as I started to meet all sorts of interesting people and figure out more about what their career calling looks like, there were a series of principles that started to emerge.
So before we talk about those principles, if it's okay.
Sure.
All right. I there's something you said before that I thought was really intriguing. And I mean, it was just interesting to me. So I don't know if it's as relevant, but you called it puberty part 2. And you mentioned how when we're young, teenage years or high school or college, it's cute to have dreams, right? And then all of a sudden, you graduate, you enter the world, and now it's like that demotivational poster that's like called Get to Work. You're not being paid to believe in the power of your dreams. It's like suddenly it's not cute anymore. And I thought puberty part 2 is such a great way of saying it, because that's what happens in actual biological puberty. Like when you're a little kid, everything is cute. But once you hit puberty, nothing's cute anymore. Like you're just not cute. And all this behavior you got away with, or the things that were entertaining to adults when you were little are no longer entertaining. And you've got this kind of like, well, no, you have to grow up now because you can't rely on being cute anymore. And then there's a disorienting time period of your teenage years. And you're just disoriented all the time. All of these expectations, all of these things you now have to step up for. Like you're like now a mini adult as opposed to a tall child, or at least that's the transition. And I thought puberty part 2 was so interesting because that's a disorienting time period for people in their 20s, and sometimes it extends into their 30s. So when you're disoriented and you have all these new expectations placed on you, it's so easy to hand yourself over to whatever the template is, which is what teenagers do too, right? Okay, well, I'm super disoriented, so I guess I'm supposed to play sports, or I guess I'm supposed to get good grades, or I guess, and then like just name whatever template feels the best to the teenager. And I think 20-somethings and 30-somethings do this too. They just hand themselves over to the template because they're not expecting that time period of a disorientation, because nobody preps you for it. Nobody says this is going to be disorienting, and it's not cute anymore to dream. Like whatever we said before, which was like, yeah, like do whatever you want. You can be an astronaut or a president. It's like that's not cute because you got to pay the bills. And so I thought that was a really fascinating correlation between those two time periods in your life. I think I'm going to see that time period differently now. I'm going to see it as a disorienting time period that we don't mentally prepare ourselves for. So how do we navigate out of that? I thought that was fascinating.
Well, and I would add to that too, that I think it used to be we had biological markers. Most people probably had children a lot younger. And so when they had a kid like in their early 20s, they're like, okay, I got to get serious. Like it would switch something. But people delaying marriage, families, the biological rites of passage that we have built into our wiring as humans, we're delaying a lot of stuff. So we're having to make up new narratives that were just pre-designed. And so to your point, Nii, when you're confused as a young person and you don't have the normal tap-in narrative of maybe family life or marriage, you look around to your peers and go, okay, what's everybody else doing? Okay, they're plugging themselves in this templatized work situation, and that must be what I need to do. And I guess I'll get to these other things I want to do around making an impact later. But let's just start here because this is what everybody else seems to be doing right now.
Yeah, and because people are delaying those things, when you don't delay them and you do get married and have kids, you still have the pressure of also having a career and an impact because your peers maybe have kicked the can of marriage and children down the road themselves. And now you're not only having to grow up quick to be responsible for your family, but now you also are comparing yourself to your friends on Instagram who are out building careers or doing something fun. And so now you have like double whammy pressure. It's a really interesting way of looking at that.
Exactly. That's exactly what happens. People in their 20s and early to mid 30s hit that phase of puberty part 2, and they're disoriented. And what happens when we're overwhelmed or confused, right? This is human nature. Whenever we're overwhelmed or confused, we look to the people around us and we say, what are they doing? And whatever they're doing, I should be doing the same thing too. And then we just hit autopilot and life happens and we have kids and we get a new house and, we get a new car and we're just going through the motions. And then before you know it, you wake up, you're 60, you're 65 and you wonder, where did my life go? Where did it all go?
Yeah. So to get back to what you were saying before, before I totally tangented off on this puberty part 2 thing, what were the principles that you called when you looked at people who did seem to be very happy with their careers?
Yeah, so there were 5 principles that kept emerging over and over again. And the first one, I like to call it work wise. And it's this idea that people that have a career calling are working wisely. They're playing to their strengths and they're being productive. That's one thing that is just so critical. People that are making an impact in the world, they're usually doing it by leaning into their strengths and honing those strengths and turning their strengths or turning their talents into a skill and using that to do meaningful, fulfilling work. The second thing that people with a career calling do is they invest in themselves. They don't limit their learning to the classroom. For them, learning is a lifelong journey that leads them to their best self. So that's something that I kept seeing over and over again. And it could be as simple as reading a new book a month, or investing in a continuing education class, or developing a new skill, but they've got a spirit or a desire to keep investing in themselves. Another thing is the third principle is they give back. They use their time and talents to help others and do good. And in doing so, it creates fulfillment and purpose and more meaning in their lives. And sometimes they give back through their work. Other times it's outside of their work. The fourth thing that kept showing up is that these people show self-love. That's the fourth principle. They know how to take care of their mind, body, and spirit because it's the only one they have. And so they carve out time to rest and recover. So it might be working out. It might be getting a massage or doing meditation. But whatever it is, they are investing in themselves and they're thinking about their life more holistically. They're not just going to work and trying to make as much money as they can. They're trying to take care of their entire essence, their mind, their body, and their spirit. And the fifth principle is they connect with care. They have relationships, meaningful relationships in their lives. They have friends in their fields as well. People who are like-minded, who also want to grow. And so they plug themselves into a community, which is innate. All humans want to be plugged into a community of some sort. And so that's something that these people do. So these were the common denominators that kept emerging over and over again.
So I'm going to push back a little bit here just for a moment. So we get a lot of people that come to us and go, man, you guys have a podcast, an online business, you sell digital products, you do live events. And there's this question, like, how did you guys do that? Like, I would love to do something that you're doing. And 9 times out of 10, I usually ask the person questions about what they're into now. And most of my recommendations are, you need to first go back and build what you talked about last time you were on the show, Nii, this idea of career capital, before you can get to the life you really want. Because it looks like Antonia and I just kind of maybe easily stepped into this, but I think one time I counted personally, I have like 17 failed business like initiatives from the time I was like 12 or 13. Some of them weren't complete failures, but they were never the success I'm having now with Personality Hacker. And I look at all of those and go, that was a lot of learning, a lot of hard work. I had to build a lot of career capital over that time to be in a position where personally I can join with Antonia and you, Nii, on the team and all the other team members and make an impact in the world. And from my perspective, there's this balance. So I want to be cautious to say that I think you, as you listening, should consider what Nii's talking about as far as like directing yourself toward a career calling. But there's a lot of nuance in what you're saying. I don't think, Nii, you are positing that you just dream big, have these 5 principles in place, and it's all going to be okay. There's embedded in these 5 principles and the things you're talking about, there's a lot of work involved, a lot of constructing your life. And I think the biggest distinction you said, Nii, that I took away is, and this is a business principle that we talk about in business all the time, like work on your business, not just in your business. Don't just be in the mundane day in and day out of a business. Work on the planning and the strategy of your business. And it sounds like that principle also translates to like if the one principle you went away with from this podcast, from my perspective, or at least the thing I would take away from this is work on my career, not just in my career. Think in terms of how does this play into a bigger picture? And sometimes that is get down into the mundane nitty gritty work of building career capital or learning a skill or something that may not be fun right now. And it may not be obvious how it links up to me making an impact in 5 years, but it's absolutely fundamental to me doing that. Does this make sense what I'm saying?
Well, so your pushback isn't that you disagree with...
I'm adding more nuance to it.
Yeah, like you're not disagreeing with that these are solid principles. It's that also embedded in the message is you got to grind too.
Exactly. That's it. That's exactly it. That's a key distinction between people that have a career calling and those who don't is people with a career calling are not just working in their careers, they're working on the careers, and they're investing in themselves, right? Most people that are following the script and they have a low risk life, they're not really investing in themselves. Right. That's what one of the things that's so powerful about what you guys talk about with Personality Hacker is how important it is for us to identify what our strengths are, how important it is for us to know what our personality type is, because it's a model and tool we can use to develop ourselves and grow. And so that's a huge difference between those who don't have a career calling and those who do. Are we just working in our career, or are we working on our career? Are we investing in ourselves, and are we working wisely? Are we playing to our strengths?
When you mentioned that concept of working wisely and being productive, I think what I've come to discover about myself is that when I have a light inside of me around something, when I mentioned, those five principles also include grind. I mean, like when I was working before I did PH, I did a lot of temp work. I did a lot of, I wasn't really building a career. I was just hopping from thing to thing. And I would have said I worked hard at all of those. I would have called that grind. And now that I'm doing something that lights me up, even when I'm doing the mundane stuff that I hate. I mean, we just recently recorded a podcast on surrender to the work, which is like there's a bunch of shit you don't want to have to do and you're going to have to do it anyway. But I've noticed that my productivity is outrageously, I'm way more productive. I am outrageously more productive when I'm working on something that I really love, because that added incentive, that fuel in the belly makes it so that I'm not just getting away with the bare minimum and calling that hard work, or I'm not doing something that is out of my skill set and working twice as hard for half the return. And so the productivity just skyrockets when I'm doing something that I really enjoy doing. And I don't know if I would have understood the level of production that comes along with passion.
So I have a question. I think I'm getting more clarity on what you're talking about, these principles. The hard work and I think what Antonia just said is absolutely true in surrender to the work. I don't mean to discount that by getting into the next point. It was like top of mind. I'm like, I got to say this quick before I forget it. When you are the metric of hard work is, does this grind invest in myself, is the question you're asking. So when you're doing because what you could take away from this conversation is, look, you just get into this career and you set yourself on autopilot, you follow the template, and you're probably working really hard, spending that 7 to 7 time period, getting ready for work, going to work, coming home from work, maybe even thinking about work on the weekends or having to do a little extra email checking, or depending on the type of job you have, you might have to take work home with you on vacation, stuff like that. Like, you're working hard, you're putting the time in. And what I hear embedded in the second principle you talked about with investing in yourself, you're doing that hard work right if that's building toward that investment. If it's just doing it because you don't know what else to do, or you're just following a template, or it's not really leading you anywhere, that's when you might need to make an adjustment in your life. Because it's not like you're saying don't work hard or put the time in. You're saying work hard and put the time in as long as it contributes to the investment in yourself, that idea of career capital or bettering yourself. So it's not just about learning, it's also about experience of doing something. And I think that's the nuance that could be very easily misunderstood in what we're trying to say here. Because I think, like on the last podcast, you talked about career capital. It almost sounds like you're saying, don't just go get the mundane job. Just follow the passions. And that's not exactly what you're saying. These principles embedded in there's a bunch of other stuff that comes from them. That is the metric. So the question that begs in my mind is, how do I know I'm investing in myself or not? Beyond just like learning, reading a new book, how do I know what I'm doing is building career capital, or if it's a dead end and I'm not? And rhetorically, I would say, well, probably every little bit is building any experience, but there probably are better experiences than others. You might not have an answer to this yet, but I'm sure you do. Like, have you thought about how you know whether you're on the right track or not in your life, Nii? Or maybe you, Antonia, too. Or you listening, maybe you come over and chime in on this. Maybe it's sparking something in your mind. How do we know we're investing in ourselves when we do the grind versus just doing the grind and wasting time?
Yeah, that's a great question. So before I dive into that, going back to this idea of hard work, it's just something that I think especially in the West, we value hard work and we think it's a virtue. And it's important to work hard, and it's also important to make sure that we're climbing the right mountain. To spend all this energy, most people spend all of their life working hard to climb a mountain, and they finally get to the top of the mountain maybe in their 60s, when they're at the time when they have the ability to make the biggest impact in the world. They arrive at the mountaintop, they're looking out, and they realize, oh crap, I'm on the wrong mountain. I should have been on that mountaintop. Well, time's up. So a lot of it is not, it's not discouraging. What we're not trying to do is discourage people from working hard. We want people to work hard, and we also want people to work wisely. And so to answer your question, I remember after sitting down with all these different interesting people, I remember thinking to myself, how do I do this? Okay, so now I found a poet, I found film directors, entrepreneurs, investors, whatever, all these interesting people that have found work they love, and I'm still young. And the next question, again being an ENTJ leading with extroverted thinking, the next question is, so how do I go from where I am now, whether it's, you're stuck in a job that's not fulfilling, or you're graduating from college, how do you go from that to a career calling? What are the steps there? So what became clear is that in our society there actually isn't a clear step or path to help people do that. It's like we've got a huge fundamental problem on a societal level, which is we don't have the tools and infrastructure to help guide people to that answer. So after lots of trial and error and experimentation and like meeting as many different people as I can, I designed a 3-step process, and I started to test it out. And it was very clunky, and I made a lot of mistakes, but I found something that worked. And while in my mid-20s, between 25 and 27, I got very clear on what direction I wanted to go in my career. I got very clear on what my career calling could be as it was emerging. Again, a career calling is something that emerges. You don't go hunt for it and find it. It emerges organically like a garden. So that was really powerful. So I can share those three steps because I think it'll give a lot of clarity. So the first step is identifying your gifts. All of us have gifts that we were given at birth. And the first step is identifying what those gifts are, because these are the cards that we've been given. We all have a set of cards. Some people have more gifts than others, right? But nonetheless, we all have gifts, and these are tools that we can use to make an impact in the world. So that was the first step. It's so important for all of us to know what we're good at, right? Because that is work. Again, the first principle is about working wisely. So one of the ways that we work wisely is we figure out, what am I good at, and how can I create situations where I can spend more of my time doing the thing I'm good at, because it's going to lead me to more success and more fulfillment, which is part of the reason why I love what you guys do at Personality Hacker. I love what our mission is. We use the Myers-Briggs as a tool to help people figure out what their strengths are. That was huge for me. I remember one of the things that helped me out when I was in my early 20s is I remember my wife and I sat down and we took the Myers-Briggs test together again. We had taken it in college, but we sat down and we took it together. And I remember discovering that I'm an ENTJ. And I remember combing through your site and learning about myself and learning what my strengths are. And it gave me clarity on the successes and failures I had with internships when I was younger and so forth. So now I had an idea of what my skills are, or not my skills are, but what my gifts are. And the goal then is to take these gifts we have and turn them into skills. And then to evolve these skills until they become our genius, where we're bringing something to the world that's not just useful, but it's poetic and it's beautiful. So that's the first step, is identifying our talents, which we all have. The second step is exploring our career interest and options and figuring out what's out there. When we're younger, right, there are not a lot of career paths that we're exposed to, right? If we step back and think about it, you probably were, as a kid, you were probably told that you could be a teacher, you could be a doctor, you could be a lawyer, an engineer, right? Maybe you can be an astronaut. But there are not a whole lot more career paths that we were exposed to in our youth beyond that. But there's so many career options and opportunities in the world, especially with the emergence of technology. With technology, we have not only new career paths, but we have new industries that have been born just months or years ago. And so the second step is learning how to explore the options and see what's out there and see, okay, well, these are the strengths I have. These are some of the options and interests I have. And the third step is finding the right role. And it's usually something that organically emerges over time.
3 steps, basically this idea of unearthing or really recognizing your superpower. Often I'll ask people what they think their superpower is. I must be kind of pre-wired this way because I'm always like at meetups or live events or when I'm talking to people, I'm like, so what is your superpower? And they're like, my superpower? Let me think about that. And they usually give me something. Often it's not what their career is. And then I ask usually like, what do you love? And often that's also not what their career is, which is interesting. But basically finding out what your superpowers are. What are the things you naturally will gravitate toward, even if you don't have skill built? And then you're talking about this idea of, from there, connecting skill to those superpowers. So you're building that career capital, I guess we could call it, like the things that you are good at. And then if you weave those together and you're working on yourself, on your career, you're investing in yourself, then there's an emergent of a role you take on that just makes sense for the things that you're good. And I think there's a breakdown in that we feel like we have to have a vision of what that end looks like before we start the journey. And it's been emergent for me. Like when I was a teenager, I wanted to be a filmmaker. I wanted to be a media producer and maybe a creative person. And here I ended up doing a lot of those things, but it's in a different business or industry. It's in personality typology, which I also was extremely attracted to as a teenager. And these things I would have never dreamed woven together now in my life. They were emergent. And when I look back, sometimes I feel like I failed because it was emergent and I didn't fulfill the dream I had at 12. Like this is almost like this fantasy of like a fatal, or fatalistic, but like a destined thing. Like I'm going to dream this at 12 and make it happen. You hear these stories, right? From like entrepreneurs or actors or whatever. They had these like childhood dreams and then they made them reality. And that's like the perfect way to go about it from what I was told as a kid.
Yeah, but that's like marrying somebody you met in kindergarten. I mean, it happens, but it's not very common.
Oh, of course. But those interests are still there. And it was interesting to see how it emerged in a much different way than I would have predicted it playing out. And as I look back on it, we were just on the movie set or the TV set for Antonia's brother's TV show on Amazon. And I was looking around thinking in terms of my childhood dreams going, wow, I'm glad I didn't end up here. Because this is a lot of it's not the kind of work that would fulfill me. It would probably be something where I'd feel stuck. It's got creative elements to it, but I'm probably going to end up getting to do a lot of the things I would have done as a filmmaker with more control, more influence, more of my own voice woven into it. I'm just not just pulling cables on somebody else's movie or TV show. So I was just reflecting on that going, I'm kind of glad I didn't get my childhood dream because the thing I got was so much better because I think the things you're talking about, Nii, is I focused on what are the things I'm good at in superpowers. How can I invest in myself? How can I build skill? And then emergent out of that was something that is way better than I could have dreamed about at 12. I didn't even know this was going to happen. And I think that's something that's really interesting in this conversation.
Yeah, and just to be clear, when I said that's like marrying somebody that you went to kindergarten with, I think there is a romanticism to all those kinds of stories. And then we get kind of caught up in that, like you were mentioning, Joel. But it's super unlikely. It is very unlikely to have a childhood dream last your entire life. I mean, you even mentioned before you wanted to be a filmmaker, you wanted to be a general in the army. So when you were a little kid. So it's really uncommon for us to just pick one track from childhood and just see it sort of ends up being exactly as you imagined it. But I think going back, is it okay if I jump to something sort of pre this conversation as well, which was your question, Joel, about how do you know what you're working on is investing in yourself. And You talked about this idea of figuring out what you're good at, figuring out a career, exposing yourself to a lot more options of careers, and then finding sort of a match between all of that. And what's interesting is embedded in this conversation around self-love and self-care and investment in the self. I think that we also have a narrow definition of what all of that is. I was thinking about when you were talking about this idea of self-care, and it could be a massage or it could be, going and working out. I was actually thinking about you and I, Joel. We spend a lot of time talking about our relationship, like making sure that we don't let challenges in our relationship metastasize and become really bad. And sometimes we'll pause, like we're supposed to record podcasts or whatever, and a conversation will start before the podcast where we're trying to get on the same page and sort of, get into the zone. And then all of a sudden a relationship challenge will rear its ugly head. And sometimes we run out of time and then we have to do the podcast anyway. But most of the time, if we have any space at all, we'll stop the productivity and we'll address the issue in the relationship. And I, for a while, thought that was just really self-indulgent. Like I was like, well, we just really want to have a good relationship, but are we being self-indulgent? And then at a certain point it hit me, our relationship is a major part of our business. Because if we don't walk the walk of what we're talking about on the podcast, which is personal development and growth and really trying to do our best in the relationship, then pretty soon our content will get very shallow really quick because we'll be talking about all these principles, but we won't be implementing them. And a big piece of what we do is the relationship between you and me. Like we're talking on the podcast a lot, and people will hear, anybody with a discerning ear will hear when there's strain or when the relationship is not as we're presenting it. So we just try to be super honest and go, yeah, we had a fight last week, or, like I was really badly behaved and you called me on it. And we mention all of those kinds of things because it's part of our self-care that relates directly to the career that we're in, the career we've chosen. So I think that the answer to the question of how do you know if you're investing in yourself for your career is what is the foundation of your career? What's it built on? And are you making sure that you're keeping yourself resourced in that way? Does that make sense at all?
Oh, it makes perfect sense. I think that's a fantastic example of this idea of showing self-love and of working on the career, not just in the career. I think those are fantastic illustrations. And what it does is it creates opportunities to have checkpoints. Part of the danger of the low risk life, of low risk living, is we just go into autopilot and we stop with the check-ins. We're just going through the motions. So having these opportunities to work on the business means stepping away from the work, taking time off, evaluating where am I at in my life right now? Where am I at? What am I good at? Am I moving in the direction I want to go? Those checkpoints allow us to calibrate and to ask ourselves, am I climbing up the right mountain, or do I need to move to another mountain?
Are we talking about also moving away from rule-based thinking? I mean, this kind of seems like this is what we're talking about too in this conversation is we're moving away from this idea of you've got to do a career this way, these check boxes, follow the template, this is what your friends and peers are doing, this is how people do it, to more principle-based thinking. So I know like some feedback I think we've all gotten when we talk about career advice is, okay, that's cool, whatever you're saying, but what are the 10 steps? It's almost like, well, if I gave you the 10 steps, like it's so unique to your situation, you're going to have to follow principles and make those steps yourself. Because by giving you the 10 steps, that's exactly what we're talking about avoiding, is just somebody handing you a template to follow. If you think in those terms, like maybe that's a way you could also see the calibration. Am I working on my career, which would be following principles, or am I working in my career, which is following the steps of tasks to do? And that's almost like that's how we can know whether we're calibrated against this or not. Are we rule-based thinking or principle-based thinking? Because as we talk, the first thing that's coming to my mind, Nii, is like, I'm just thinking about all the dissent, like all the I'm a mismatcher by nature, right? So I'm always thinking of all the pushback, like, well, what about this? What about this? What about, like, even if I was young, what would my dissent be? What would my pushback be? And it would be like, well, it's still esoteric. It's still principle-based. And I think that's the point in some ways.
Yeah, having to put the thought and intention into it is a big piece. Like if you like a big part of it is putting the in like the mental labor, the thought labor into connecting the principles to your unique situation.
Yeah, you're absolutely right about that. And because I lead with extroverted thinking, I can't help but break things down into practical steps. I know you guys are EPs, so I know you love your high level principles and concepts, right? For some of us, we need a little bit more. And so I had a compulsion to break this down and come up with steps, really practical, concrete steps. And I started to organize it and teach it to other people. And over the last several years, I've been able to help several people, countless people in multiple countries, be able to go from white knuckle work where they're just going through the motions to finding work they love. And I've finally been able to distill all of this down into an online video course called the Career Calling School. And it's about helping you identify what are your gifts and genius? What are the things that you bring to the world that nobody else can bring to the world? What are those? It's designed to help people figure out what to do with their lives. That's such a big question. It's an overwhelming question, especially when you just have a little bit of life left over after 9 to 5. And then finally, it shows you how to take all those things, what you're good at. It helps you identify what your skill or what your interests are, or what options you have, and use that to land the right role that's perfect for you. Because again, being someone who leads with effectiveness or extroverted thinking, being an ENTJ, I have to have something that's very concrete, practical, and specific.
Okay, that's a fair point. You're right. We are two ENPs. And I'm always like, what's the principle? And you've got to tie it to your specific circumstance. So I still think that piece is there, right? Like having to put the thought into it. But you're right. As a person who's extroverted think, you probably do have some concrete steps. So we'll meet in the middle. And so I think that as a person who has followed kind of a similar path that you're talking about, if I retrospectively look at some of the things that we've done to get to a place where I'm very actually happy with the direction that my career is going. I'm very happy with where I'm at. And I resonate with actually some of the principles you're talking about. I think I would have struggled early on to understand how they relate, but I think in retrospect, it's a lot easier to go, yeah, no, I think you've got a pretty solid formula. So I think it's interesting that you created some step-by-steps because it is much easier to understand those things when you're looking backwards than trying to figure out how to put them in place as you're moving forward. That whole concept of hindsight being 20/20. There is one thing that I do want to say. I know we probably have to wrap up. There is one thing I do want to say from a comment that you made, Nii, where you were talking about this idea of getting to a certain age and you get into your 60s and like time's up and you went down the wrong road. And I know that you were mentioning sort of that's the template or that's the rule. You know, the rule is that if you haven't figured it out by that time, then you're just screwed. But I do want to kind of represent quote unquote old people for a second because I'm realizing that I'm an old person now, or at least I'm quickly approaching it. I think what's nice about the modern world is that those rules are also being reevaluated. Like, I think that you can have an impact and make a career change and do something radically different at a time period where people don't think you can anymore. Do you remember you and I, Joel, were in the airport in California and we met the guy who created, what was it? It was like a blender. There was like I'm trying to remember what. It's like it's a recognizable brand at this point. And we were just happened to be sitting next to him and struck up a conversation. And he was a self-made, multimillionaire many times over. And he had I don't know if it was an invention or if he had done the marketing, but he was now a self-made millionaire. And he said he didn't start until his mid to late 50s. Like, he started the process in his mid to late 50s. And so he was in a very comfortable situation, but that is oftentimes where people think that you are past your time of impact. I remember hearing that you do the most impact between the ages of 40 and 55, but he was doing his most impact after the age of 55. So I did want to mention that I think what's nice about the modern world is that we have the ability to go around the biases, because before it was like, oh, after a certain age, you're not hireable anymore. But we have so many opportunities to create a career for ourselves or use the seasoning of age as long as we're not too afraid of the technology that we'll have to interface with in order to get there, as long as you can get through like the comfort piece of not having to do it in templatized ways, I think you can be literally any age and start to have an impact. Another example would be a woman who, she and her sister were in not great health, and at the age of 75, they both decided that we're going to take up weightlifting. They were twins. And so she started doing weightlifting at 75, and now she's in her 80s. Her sister has since died, but she's in her late 80s, and now she's gotten all this notoriety as a person in their late 80s that's a deadlifter. So I feel like this concept, or the concepts and principles you're talking about, can actually apply at literally any age.
So as we start to land the plane here on this podcast, you're listening along, you heard some of the principles Nii talked about. Nii, if there is something that somebody listening could take away, like what is the one message? What's the one thing, the one distinction, the one thing that like chew on this, like from your perspective, what's the thing that you can see being powerful for yourself maybe in pursuing a career? What would you have wanted to hear from this podcast? Like the final message to go away with, talking about this topic of pursuing a career calling in your life, not just a career you're okay with, but something that juices you up. It's passionate. Maybe you have a plan to get to the ultimate thing, but you're on your path there. What is it that would have been something that would have really impacted you personally at a time in your life when you could have heard that message? If you have one thing, it could be a couple things, but what's the closeout, I guess?
Instead of thinking about our life and our work as two separate things, we should see it as one. Our work is our life, because we're going to spend most of our waking life working. So instead of adopting this perception that the West has, that you're trying to achieve a work-life balance, which is again a myth, right? Because at the end of the day, after we take away all the time we spend preparing for work, actually working, and unwinding from work, and then you also add how many hours we spend every night sleeping, 7 to 8 hours, there's just not a lot of life left over. So instead of trying to live your life, instead of trying to live a life of leftovers, it's important that we redefine our relationship to work and see our work and our life as one. And in doing so, we are setting ourselves up to have a more fulfilling life, particularly if we can find a career calling, work that wields our gifts to make an impact in the world. And then I would say the second point is that we want to make sure that we're not just working in our careers, but we're working on our careers, and that we create opportunities where we step back from the work and we ask ourselves the question, am I climbing up the right mountain, right? Am I investing in cultivating the right skills? Am I taking what I have and improving it, whatever gifts and talents I've been given? I think that's so important, that reflection. I don't think our culture creates many opportunities for it. I think so many people are living the low risk life. They're going through the rat race, and we're constantly moving. And our culture loves activity. We associate activity with productivity, but the two aren't the same thing. Just because we're moving around and doing a lot of things, it doesn't mean we're being productive. Sometimes the most productive thing we can do is step back for a moment, slow down, and ask ourselves penetrating, thought-provoking questions about who we are and where we're going in life. And that's the beginning of the journey.
So this idea of picking the right mountain to go up, and also probably a sense of, sometimes I'm getting this instinct that sometimes we pick mountains based on their ability to measure them. So I think in terms of like the Ken Burns documentary about Vietnam, there's this segment in there where they talked about the generals going, like, literally, we're going to go take that mountain, and sending the troops up. And they would measure the success on taking the mountain. They would get to the top and literally take over the mountain, like militarily. And then they would determine the success rate based on a body count ratio. How many on our side did get killed, and how many did we kill on the other side? And then the story was that they would abandon that mountain and go on to some other theater and fighting. And then they'd be like, oh, wait, why did we give them that? Let's go take that mountain again. It would be reclaimed. They would charge back up the exact same mountain they'd already conquered. And it was almost like there was a way to measure it, or there was an obvious mountain to take. So let's go take that mountain. There's a lot of things that were obvious to all the soldiers there in Vietnam to go take these mountains. But it's like, what's the point of taking that mountain? Like, why are you doing it in the first place? It's almost like a premise level question of when you're selecting the mountain or the career mountain, let's just say it's a career metaphor for your career. How are you measuring that, and how are you choosing that? Because maybe you've chosen it because it's obvious. It's right in front of you. There's a way to measure it. And measuring in this case is look around to other people around you. What are your peer groups or society telling you? It's an easy way to measure the mountain you're conquering. But like you said, you get to the top and you're like, man, I might be in my later years going, well, I took this hill, but why did I take this hill? I should be over there, or I didn't really pick the right hill to take, did I? But I picked it because it was right in front of me. And so there's this, it's probably counterintuitive and it's this idea of slowing down. Working on your career means slowing down, look at all the different career mountains and say, am I picking this because it's easy to measure? Am I picking this because it's so obvious in front of me? What are maybe other things if I could get a little perspective? Get in a drone and go up and like look over the terrain, or metaphorically speaking, and try to determine what those are. I think that principle is really powerful because it backs us up and says, why are we doing this in the first place? And that probably goes back to some fundamental things in your life as you listen. What are you actually here to do? Why does it matter? The why, right? The why of life. What is it that you ultimately want to do? And the other thing that comes up from that principle, though, is that might be a hard question to answer early on in your early life. Like you might have like a bunch of kind of whys. Like it gets more narrow as you get more clear about this over time. So, and that goes back to, again, our conversation about career capital that we had when last time you were on the show, is kind of build so that when that is more clear, you're going to have the resources to capitalize on it. I think in terms of that gentleman you talked about, Antonia, that built the blender at 55, you're like, he just got started at 55. No, he didn't. He got started a lot sooner than that. He built on a lifetime of something. Like you don't just at 55 go, I'm going to go invent this and become a millionaire. Like he had to have built career capital for that to be possible. But maybe he didn't know that was what he was going to do to contribute, but he kind of had an inkling of the right mountain to start going toward. And I don't even know if I helped answer anything. I might have just opened up a bunch more loops and like just conversing about this, but that's what comes to mind as you say that.
Yeah, I think what's so interesting about work in the Western world is we've got this huge problem that there are lots of people that want to make an impact in the world. They want to do something that's meaningful because this is the one life we have. But the problem and challenge is our society hasn't really equipped us with the tools to navigate the world and figure out how to go from where we are to a fulfilling career. We don't really have a lot of tools for that. That was part of the reason I felt compelled to create the Career Calling School, is because when I looked around, I just didn't see a clear solution. I saw a lot of like platitudes and high level advice, like just do what you love or follow your passion, or things like that we all heard growing up. And again, for me, being someone who leads with extroverted thinking, that was never enough. So coming up with a set of steps became really important. And even though there are steps, it's still an organic process. And I think that's also something that can be difficult for us to absorb in the Western world. We like clean, crisp solutions that we like sound bites. We like things that are just perfect and neat. And the reality is that the world we live in is not perfect and neat. And so it's this interesting tension. It was a cool experience creating the course because I had to strike the balance between providing those practical, concrete steps that anybody can follow regardless of the context, but also create space to allow the organic process to emerge as well. So it's not a one-size-fits-all cookie cutter solution. There are steps that someone can follow, but we also have to learn to embrace the journey and remember and realize that the journey is actually the destination.
Yeah. To piggyback off of your metaphor, Joel, of the Vietnam War, or your analogy rather, the idea of using body count as a metric, like they lost more guys than we did, shows that when you're not really sure what it is, like you've lost sight of what it is you're trying to accomplish, you'll attach to really lame metrics, like maybe even like really bad and harmful metrics. And I think in the concept of career, I think a lot of us attach to really bad metrics. the metric of how much money we're making, or whether or not we're covering the bills, or, you know, like things that indicate that we've sort of lost sight of the end game, as opposed to metrics like, you know, freedom of time or personal satisfaction. And I suspect that as you were going through your process of creating content around this, knowing you as a person, and of course, again, knowing that you lead with extroverted intuition, but also you have your introverted intuition to extroverted thinking, because I was about to say introverted intuition, supplementing it. Thank you. That there's probably one of the things is the introduction of better metrics. Like, I think that gives a little bit of space for the organic nature, because what specifically you choose is you know, that's you as an individual, that's unique to you. But how are you going to measure it? And how are you going to determine whether or not you're on the right career path? So, so I think that this is all just a really interesting concept and topic. And I think it's really important right now, since I hear, especially from your generation as millennials, but I hear it from Gen Xers who are doing a transition in career, or like starting to realize they got to get their act together, all the way up to people who are maybe even exiting that middle-aged time period, going like, what, like, did I leave the mark I wanted to leave? What am I supposed to do here? I think no matter where you're at, as if you don't have the career you wanted, this is a question you're asking.
So you've been listening to this conversation. You haven't been part of the conversation right now, but now's your chance to come over. What's your career been like? Have you been working in your career? Have you been working on your career? Well, how are you measuring it? What are some of the things, these principles that Nii shared today, how are they resonating with you? Do they make sense? Are there things that you've noticed as you connect the dots, looking back? Maybe you're later in your career and you go, wow, I did a lot of those things, and that's why I'm so fulfilled or happy, or I feel like I'm on the right path toward the thing I want. Maybe you're starting out. Maybe you're in college and you're freaking out because you're going to graduate soon, and you're like, oh my gosh, like I'm taking notes what Nii's talking about because I want to do something passionate, but I know that there's got to be a path from here to there, and I don't know what to do. I'm not exactly sure the steps. I hear some of the principles, and we'd love to hear your story as well, because I think that in the community we can get a lot of conversation around this. And of course, my recommendation is to check out Nii's course, Career Calling. I think it's a great avenue for people that are looking to connect some of these things going forward. And that's one of the reasons why we're endorsing it. And part of it is because of the thinking he's put behind it and the experimentation over many years to connect some of the dots to help create a path. I think one of the things that I love about Nii is his passion for people that are younger than him to basically go, man, I wish I'd had this coming up. And he has a passion for helping connect people that want to do passionate work. And there's a lot of levels of this. I think that, you know, if you're in college and you're ready to enter the workforce, this can be really helpful. But also these ideas, I think there's like this 27, 28-year-old time period in our lives where we tend to enter the real career time period of our lives. I've noticed this. I talked to a friend of mine in Washington, D.C. I said, tell me about Washington, D.C. He said, everybody's 28 years old and they've already kind of had some work under their belt, but they just came to DC to start their real career, whatever that is. And it's usually around that time period that we lock into something that ends up defining our career for a long time. And that's usually, when you're starting out, that's where a hill can be chosen to go up. But I bet that more around the time in your late 20s is when you still have enough time to change hills before you get locked or stuck. And it seems like around that time, that's when people go, okay, I got a little experience. Now I'm going to start. It goes from having a job to really formulating a career path. And I think that's the sweet spot where, if you're a 27, 28-year-old, I remember being 27, 28. That's like the time period where things happen around this idea. I don't know if you resonate that with that, Nii, but that's something that I think is a time period that special attention needs to be put to.
Yeah, I think most of the people that have been able to take these principles in the process that I teach in the course and make the most of it, a lot of them, to your point, not all of them, but a lot of them are between that range of like 27 to 37, right? It's around that phase that we are maturing as adults. We have a clear sense of who we are. we've worked we've been in the work world for a little bit now, and we've got a little bit more experience, and now these are opportunities to step back. Or even that person that's right around the 40s and you're hitting that halfway mark and you're stepping back and saying, wow, okay, I'm approaching 40 or just hit 40, and I still have another 20, 30 years left. Is this the direction I want to keep going, or do I need to calibrate?
Yeah, I mean, the embryo for Personality Hacker was in my early 30s, but we didn't really get serious about it and really start making this a thing until our mid 30s, really. So I think that that's also a time period. I mean, if I had gone the traditional route, maybe I would have felt that way in my late 20s. Like I was really starting my career around 28, but just because of my circumstances, I guess I'm a late bloomer, but that was more of a mid 30s decision for me.
So if you'd like to come over and leave a comment, ask a question, you can do that right below this podcast over at personalityhacker.com. Love to hear from you. I think it would be really great for you to enter into this conversation with us. And let's have a conversation about how this looks for you.
Yeah. And before we complete, thank you so much, Nii, once again for joining us and sharing some of the wisdom that you've called with people navigating their careers.
Thank you.
So if you enjoyed this podcast, you can subscribe to us on iTunes and various Android platforms. You can leave us a rating and review on iTunes. We have a book. Go buy it and leave us a rating and review on Amazon. That also helps us out a lot.
That's right. My name is Joe Markwitt.
And I'm Antonia Dodge.
And we'll talk with you on the next Personality Hacker Podcast.